Hello there, and welcome back to our study of the book of Matthew as we are reading through this gospel in preparation for Easter. And I am recording this right as we are getting ready to head into Holy Week. And so, as we're reading right now, we are entering those last chapters of Matthew, that last week of Jesus' life. But today, for this recording, I'm going back a few weeks and looking at some of the chapters that we were reading 2 weeks ago when we were in Matthew 17 to 21. And I want to look at a few highlights of that. And then I will come out with another teaching later this week about Holy Week and what's happening this week as we are approaching Easter. But thanks for joining me. I'm excited to dive in again with you today. So let's start in Matthew 17. We're going to start there. And in this chapter, we see the story of the Transfiguration of Jesus. This was one of those really very significant events in the life of Jesus. There's a lot going on here, so I want to talk about that a little bit. That is followed by Jesus doing another healing a boy who has a demon. Then we have Jesus foretelling his death and resurrection. And then he does a brief teaching at the end of this chapter about the temple tax. So I want to talk about the Transfiguration. I want to start there. So right before Matthew 17, in Matthew 16, we had seen Peter give his confession of who Jesus was. This is when Jesus is with his disciples and he says to them, "Hey, who are people saying that I am?" And they're giving him all kinds of answers. Some people are saying you're John the Baptist. Some saying you're Elijah. And then Jesus says, "Yes, okay, but who do you say that I am?" And it's in that passage that we say Peter saying to him, "So you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And so here we have Peter making the confession of who Jesus is. And remember, as we've been going through Matthew, the disciples don't have a clear picture yet of who Jesus is. They're trying to wrap their minds around it. But this is this first time that we see one of the disciples actually say, "Okay, yes, I believe you're the Christ, the Son of the living God." So this is a monumental moment here. And so right after that happens, then we see this story in the beginning of Matthew 17 where Jesus takes his disciples. He takes three of them. He takes Peter, James, and John, and he takes them up the mountain, and they get to experience this transfiguration. And so he goes up on the mountain, and if you read this particular story is in several of the Gospels. If you read it in Luke, it mentions that Jesus is going up the mountain to pray. And listen, this is Jesus preparing for the cross. He knows that it is almost here, that we are entering this final stretch, and he knows what lays ahead of him. And I think it's so interesting that you see this throughout the life of Jesus, where he takes time to get away and be with the Father, to talk to the Father, and to pray. And this is a beautiful picture of that human side of Jesus. I think it's so easy for us to focus on his deity as the Son of God and forget that he was also fully human. And I know it's hard for us to wrap our minds around that and what that looked like, but in this story, as we see him getting away and going up on that mountain to spend time with the Father, I think it's a beautiful picture of just that side of Jesus that's like, okay, I need some confirmation here. I need some reassurance that I'm on the right path and this is what needs to happen, that I'm doing this right. And he needed some strength. He definitely needed some strength for what lay ahead of him in the next week. And so he goes up there, talks about how he was transfigured, his face shone like the sun, his clothes were white as light. And then it talks about how Moses and Elijah appear with him on the mountain in this transfiguration. And in Luke 9, again, if you read it in the Luke passage, it talks about how Moses and Elijah were actually talking to each other on this mountain as they're standing there with Jesus. And they're talking about Jesus and his departure from Jerusalem, which was coming soon. And again, I think it's so beautiful that Jesus is getting here. He is standing with two of the greatest figures in Israel's history. Moses, he was seen as the chief lawgiver. And then you have Elijah, who was seen as like the chief prophet for the nation of Israel. And so you have these two heroes of the faith. These were heroes for the Jewish people. And here they are standing there talking about what's getting ready to happen, how Jesus is getting ready to depart from Jerusalem. Again, just a confirmation that, yes, you are on the right path. This is what needs to happen. This has already been foretold. There are some similarities between the life of Moses and Elijah. It's so interesting that those are the two that were up there on the mountain with Jesus, because both of those men, they both had very significant encounters with God on a mountaintop. In fact, Mount Sinai. They also both had very unique death circumstances. These are two of the three men that we have recorded in Scripture who had death situations where they either didn't die or there was something unusual about it. For instance, Moses, it says that he went up on the mountain to die and that nobody knew where he was buried. It was as if he went up on the mountain with God and either he died and God buried him or God just took him. We don't know. There's some question about what did that look like at the end for Moses. And then Elijah, of course, is the one who he goes up to heaven. It just says he went up to heaven in chariots of fire. And then we have the other one, the third one that we read about in the Old Testament is Enoch, who it says he walked with God and then just one day he was no more. And so Moses and Elijah shared these unusual death circumstances. And they also, both of these men, Moses and Elijah, they were also both expected to return in some form or fashion in connection with the Messianic age. So it was significant that they were the ones that were showing up on this mountaintop with Jesus in this transfiguration. And one of the things I love about this story is the fact that you have Jesus and Moses and Elijah, and it just brings this unity to the Bible, this unity to the one story that is seen throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because listen, Jesus is not just in the New Testament. You can see the story of Jesus all the way from the very beginning, and it just weaves through the entire Scripture, Old and New Testament. And so for you to have these very significant characters from the Old Testament present with Jesus on this mountain, it is just this beautiful picture that the Bible is one story. It's not two stories, and it's one God. There's not a God of the Old Testament and a God of the New Testament. This is one God with one story, and we see that beautifully displayed in this story as they are on the mountain together. Now, mountains, of course, this occurred on a mountain. There were very significant encounters with God that happened on mountains throughout the Bible. And we also see there's a cloud involved in this story, and clouds for the Jewish people, the cloud often signified the presence of God's glory. And now, so we read this story. We read about how Peter, James, and John are up there with Jesus. And I think it's so interesting to see how Peter responds when he sees this. And so, we're in the beginning of Matthew 17. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." Okay, so he says this, and I think it's so funny because when I was studying this, there was some commentators said, this could just be the fact that Peter's in shock, which would be understandable based on what is happening right now. It could be that he was just in shock and looking for words to say, like, how do I be hospitable in this moment? What can I do? But most scholars believe that this particular story here, what Peter is trying to do is he is trying to keep Jesus on the mountain. Let's stay in this place. Because remember, not only had in the previous chapter had Peter just confessed who he believed Jesus to be. This wasn't just a great teacher. This wasn't just a great prophet who was doing some really amazing things. This was the Christ, the Son of the living God. So he had made that confession. Right after that, Jesus had told him that he was going to die and what that was going to look like. We also see Peter, after he hears this, it's almost like he's trying to do an intervention for Jesus, like saying, hey, listen, dude, you're the Messiah. This is not how this needs to go down. You can't go die. This isn't going to work. And that's when Jesus then turns around and says, "Get behind me, Satan." So Peter's got this roller coaster going on, right? Roller coaster of all kinds of emotions and feelings. So he's trying to wrestle with the fact that Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is telling him he's going to die. And then he's getting this experience on the mountain with Jesus shining like the sun. Moses and Elijah are there. It's this amazing moment. And it's believed that Peter was just in a state of, hey, let's just stay here. This is much better than what you say you want to do than your plan. I think this plan is a better plan. Let's just stay here. Let's set up camp. Let's build some houses, and we'll just stay here on the mountaintop. We don't need to go down there and follow through with that crazy plan that you have, which doesn't make any sense. So we're just going to stay here. And so a lot of scholars believe that that is what Peter is doing here. And I find it interesting, if you read this story in the Gospel of Mark, makes a comment in there that it says Peter didn't know what he was saying because he was afraid. And that makes me laugh because a lot of scholars believe that Peter had a heavy influence in the writing of Mark. He and Mark were very close. And so I can almost see Mark writing out this particular story and Peter sitting there with him, recounting the events and saying, hey, make sure you tell him that, yeah, I was just really scared out of my mind and I didn't know what I was saying when I said that. So make sure you clarify that in there. It makes me smile when I think about that possibility. So I think this idea, though, that Peter was really just wanting to stay. Like, let's just stay up here because I don't like what we're getting ready to face. What you say is coming, it doesn't sound good. It doesn't make sense to me. So let's just stay up here. And so this idea that Peter just wanted to stay on the mountaintop, like this was a great place. It was safe. It was some amazing things were happening. And what Jesus had said was coming, the plan didn't sound good to him. And he just wanted to stay. And it just reminds me that so often we can have these mountaintop experiences with God where we just get to experience him in ways that are so significant and so special. And there can be a part of our human nature that just wants to stay there. Like we don't want to leave this moment where we are having this encounter with God and we don't want to just go back to our everyday life. Let's just stay right here. And yet Jesus knew that they had to go off that mountaintop. They could not stay in this moment. This moment was significant. They needed this moment. They were going to need the strength that they were getting from this moment. And remember I said earlier about Jesus' humanity, like part of this probably was him just needing some confirmation, some reassurance, and some strength for what he was getting ready to face. And not only does he get Moses and Elijah standing there confirming, yeah, this is it. You're the one we dreamt about. You're the one that we foretold for years. Yeah, here we are. This is happening. But not only that, but he gets God speaking. And this is the third time we see God speak over his son with whom he is very well pleased. And so he gets that confirmation, that actual audible voice from his father saying, yes, son, this is the plan. You are doing the right thing. I'm so proud of you. And so he gets that reassurance. This moment was so important for him. It was also very important for the disciples to see Jesus just in all of his glory, that the glory that was shining all over him. It was important that they see him for what they were getting ready to face. But Jesus knew they couldn't stay there. They had to go back down off of the mountain. And right after this, as they head down off the mountain, they walk straight into a mess. You've got this brokenhearted father who is desperately looking for help for his son. You've got these disciples who had been trying to cast this demon out. They had failed. And so Jesus walks right into this, right into all these emotions, the disappointment of his faithless disciples, this brokenhearted father who's just desperate for somebody to touch his son. And he walks from the mountaintop right into this. I want to read you a little bit from Matt Woodley and his commentary on the book of Matthew. He says this. He says, most of us like it when Jesus invites us up and then heals us on the mountaintop. We resist or even resent the call to come down into the world's ugliness and pain. But as the Church of Jesus Christ, we should train our ears and our eyes to hear and see both Christ's glory and the world's brokenness. We should yearn for glimpses of God's glory, and we should spend time doing nothing but listening to the Father. But we also don't want to look away from the world's pain and agony. With Jesus, we'll descend the mountain of glory, but we will also walk among the anguished and the imperfect people around us. Listen, it is both. We see that with Jesus, and it's true for us as well. There will be those mountaintop experiences, and we need those. We need those encounters with Jesus. That is not going to define our entire Christian walk. There are going to be lots of times when we are just down in the middle of the world's brokenness, and Jesus, we have to live there too, and we have to be open to what he is doing in those seasons and how he wants to use us. William Barclay, another commentator, he says this. He says, real religion is to draw strength from God in order to give it to others. And I loved that particular quote because it's such a great reminder that these mountaintop experiences are not just for us. A big part of it is that we get filled up so we can come off the mountain and into the brokenness of this world and bring healing and light and comfort and love, and we can be the hands and feet of Jesus. And so as soon as this transfiguration experience ends, they come down, they meet the boy with the demon. In Mark 9, if you read the passage in there, it talks about how Jesus tells his disciples, because his disciples are asking him, hey, why were we not able to do this? We've done this before. Why could we not cast out this demon? And he says this kind can come out by nothing but prayer, which would kind of imply that the disciples must have been trying to do this in their own strength based on how they'd done this before. They were just trying to do it by them, but just they figured they could do it. They weren't asking God for help. And Jesus is reminding them, hey, you still need to be praying. You still need to be asking the Father to help you. We then see Jesus goes on to foretell his death and resurrection. This is the second time we have seen this. We saw it just previously in the previous chapter. And then it ends with a section on temple tax and some debates going on back and forth between who owes what and are they supposed to pay the taxes. Okay, now we're going to move on to chapter 18. Let's talk for a few minutes about this chapter. This is a chapter full of Jesus teaching, a lot of it aimed at the disciples. It starts off with the disciples arguing about who is going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And this is when Jesus turns around and says, hey, you need to be more like children. Whoever humbles himself like a child, they will be the greatest. I want to look at 7 qualities we see in this chapter. And the first one is that right there, humility, that we are to be humble. That's in verses 1 through 4. The second one is responsibility. And when I use that word, I am talking about us being responsible for our example and our influence. It doesn't matter who you are leading somebody. There is somebody that is watching you. If not one person, there are a host of people. We are all leaders. There are people that are influenced by our choices. They're watching us. And so as Christians, it's important that we take that seriously, that we are serious about our responsibility to lead people well and to set a good example. He talks in here about, and this is in verses 5 to 7, and he talks about what a big deal it is if you cause somebody else to sin. In fact, he says it would be better for him to have a millstone fastened around his neck and drowned in the depths of the sea than to lead another one astray. And this was a big deal. This was not something to be taken lightly. So we've got responsibility. Then the third one is self-denial. This is in verses 8 through 10, or self-sacrifice. This is the idea that we are willing to cut out anything in our life that keeps us from following Jesus. And anything that keeps us from doing that with our whole heart, we need to be willing to cut it out and to remove it. The fourth one is caring for the individual person. This is the parable that we see in here of the lost sheep. This is one of my favorite. I love this particular parable where you see the shepherd who is willing to leave the 99 behind to go after the one that is lost. It's this beautiful picture of the heart of our Father, of our shepherd. But it is also, as Christians, we are called to the same thing. We are called to see people for who they are, not just see the crowd, but to see the individual people, the individual person who is hurting, broken. Maybe they feel forgotten and nobody sees them. Do we see them? We are called to care for the individual. The fifth one that we see in here, this is in verses 15 to 20, is discipline. And I'm not talking about discipline like be disciplined to eat well or exercise, but the willingness to lovingly confront people when we need to. That is not, the Christian life is not just about kindness and forgiveness. Those are huge and we need to practice them. But we also need to be willing to walk with people and point out the truth when we need to. This is the passage about if the brother sins against you, make sure you go to him and you try to work it out. And if that doesn't work, then you bring somebody with you and you do the witnesses, and it builds up to how to handle this particular situation. I think the important thing is that we remember that, hey, relationships are important and we are called to community, but when something's not right, we need to address it. like we need to be willing to address it and be willing to talk it over with people. It's important that we live our lives in a way that we're willing to not only be vulnerable ourselves and share when we're struggling so other people can walk with us, but we need to be open to loving correction from other people that are in relationship with us. Listen, this is not about you go out there and correct everybody that you see who is not doing the things that you feel like they should be doing. This is about when you are in relationship with somebody, being willing to be that one that's the iron sharpening iron. You're pointing out those things that need to be resolved, need to be addressed. Then we have fellowship, this idea of fellowship. We see that in verses 19 to 20 about the, let's, when 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am. So the idea of fellowship, living in community, we are not called to live alone. We're not called to live in isolation. God calls us to live in community. And then finally, it ends with the parable of the unforgiving servant. And we see in this story the importance of forgiveness as Christians, how we are called to forgive. And this final parable, the one of the unforgiving servant, I just want to give you a couple little things I found when I was studying that I thought was interesting. So you have this story of this king, and he's settling his accounts with his servants. And he's got this servant who owes him 10,000 talents. Now, we can hear that, and that's not a form of currency that we use, and it doesn't mean a whole lot to us. But when you look at what a talent actually was, a talent was equivalent to 15 years' wages. So a talent was a lot of money. And then that word 10,000, that was the highest number in the Greek language. And a talent was the highest level of currency. So this was the highest level of currency they had, and the highest number that they even used in their language. You had 10,000 talents. I mean, this was a staggering debt. And I think when you realize that and you understand that, then you understand, okay, when Jesus is telling this parable and he's using 10,000 talents, they're immediately going to, okay, this is obviously exaggerated. He's trying to make a point here. Jesus wants us to understand that this is a debt that we could not even fathom. Like, it's beyond any debt we've ever seen or ever heard of. This was a debt that this man could never possibly ever repay. And then later, when he does get forgiven, and then he turns around and jumps all over the guy that owes him, what was it, 100 denarii. Okay, well, that was, a denarii was like a day's wage. This is not 100 days wages. I mean, that was nothing compared to what this first servant had been forgiven. And it's just this beautiful picture of the lavish and extravagant love of our Father. Just like if you remember when we talked about the parable of the sower and the farmer representing God, and how it was this picture of God has this he would just lavishly and extravagantly sows the seed, right? It just goes everywhere. Well, this is a similar picture of the heart of the Father, that he is so lavish and so extravagant with his forgiveness that he will generously forgive any debt, no matter how large it is. And then finally, Matthew 19 and 20, there's a lot of conversations in these two chapters about how the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Jesus is constantly warning the firsts that they shouldn't take it for granted. And I think a lot of this is being directed towards the religious leaders, the ones who think that they are special, but also to the Jews in general, because the Jews they were God's special people, but they took that and the pride that they had over that, and they would hold it over other people. And we see over and over again through this gospel how God despises spiritual smugness, right? This idea of I am spiritually superior to you, it was not something that set well with God, and Jesus was very vocal about it. And if we go back to the Beatitudes in Matthew 5, there is something about this idea of being in a state of spiritual poverty and recognizing who we are and that we are nothing without God, the humility that comes from that. And we see throughout the Old Testament God reminding his people that, yes, they are his chosen ones. They are the people of God. But there was a privilege and a duty that came from that. In fact, we can see this in Genesis 2. We see it in Isaiah 49, that they were chosen by God to be blessed and then to turn around and to bless the whole earth. It was through the blessing that they had received that they were to turn around and bless everybody else. It was not just for them. And it was not to make them special and elite and better than everybody else. This was just the way that God had chosen to spread his gospel, and the way he had chosen to bless the world was through his people, the Jews. There was a duty and a privilege that came from their calling as God's chosen ones. And then at the end of Matthew 20, we have Jesus reminding his disciples again that he is getting ready to face suffering, death, and then an eventual resurrection. And then right after that, we see the disciples arguing amongst themselves about who is going to be on Jesus' right hand and who is going to be on his left hand in the kingdom. Again, they are, of course, when I read this, I'm like, okay, guys, he just told you what's getting ready to happen, and this is what you're going to argue with him about? Like, can you not read the room, like understand the seriousness of this moment? And it just reminds me of, as in our human nature, how we just clamor and we strive for that position. And as a culture, I mean, we are so infatuated with celebrities that want people that have all the power and have the position. And part of that is because we want that. That's something that we want. And we see that with the disciples. Like, they want position. They want authority. They want there should be some prestige for what they've gone through the last 3 years. Like, what's in it for them? And as they're arguing about this, and Jesus is once again trying to set them straight, and again telling them that whoever would be great among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Again, this idea that the first will be last and the last will be first. And right after that, talks about how he goes and he heals 2 blind men. You see in this great crowd is following him, and there's 2 blind men. They're sitting by the road, and they hear that Jesus is passing by, and they cry out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." And the crowd rebukes them, tells them to be silent, but they cry out even louder, just saying, "Lord, have mercy on us." And stopping, Jesus calls to them, and he has pity on them, and he heals them. But I find it so interesting that here you have this crowd, and you have the disciples clamoring over their position, and where will they be in relation to, where will they be sitting, in this coming kingdom? And you have this crowd that's following Jesus. They are all worked up, but they have an idea of who Jesus is and what he's going to do for them. And they can't be interrupted by the people on the side of the road who are desperately needing healing. This is just an interruption. They tell them to be quiet, to leave them alone, trying to get rid of them. And then Jesus stops and has pity on them. He has compassion on them, and he heals them. And by healing these blind men, Jesus demonstrates to us that one way to grip the bondage of fame and power that is it's so easy to fall into, but one way to break it is to pay attention to the little people. Jesus always paid attention to the little people, the ones that were forgotten, the ones at the edge of the crowd, the ones that were not accepted in society. Those were the ones that he was drawn to. Those were the ones that he moved closer to. And I think the challenge to us is a reminder that we need to go to those marginal places and show an extraordinary love for just the ordinary people. Not the ones that are going to give us power or fame or authority. Not the ones that we can get something from, but the ones that we can just love in the name of Jesus and be Jesus to them. And when we offer generous portions of mercy to those that are mercy starved, we are a beautiful picture of Jesus, the one that we have been reading about through this book of Matthew. And when we can do that, it gets our focus off of ourselves and what we want, and it turns our focus back to other people, which is where Jesus' focus always was. And so that's my recap of Matthew 17 to 21. Join me next time as we are getting closer and closer to that final week of Jesus' life. But thank you for joining me today, and I will see you for the next teaching. Thanks.